the original Maleficent, like, is pretty well known for dealing with, like, gender and assault. And I think you can argue that both the original Maleficent and this new one also kind of deal with, like, environmentalism, possibly. But this film deals less with those themes of the first film. The subtitle Maleficent 2 is Mistress of Evil, and I spent the whole film trying to figure out who the Mistress of Evil was. Because was it supposed to be Maleficent? Because Maleficent, as far as we know, like, isn't evil. Like, that's kind of the point of the story, is that Maleficent isn't evil. But there were, of course, other candidates in the film. There was the Queen, played by Michelle Pfeiffer, and I don't remember her name, so we're just gonna call her Michelle Pfeiffer. And Michelle Pfeiffer's, like, assistant, head of her military, person of arms. I don't know what to call her. She didn't look like a knight, so I'm not going to call her a knight. But anyway, so you have these two women who, like, could be the Mistress of Evil, and, like, Queen could be, like, mistress, since mistress is, like, the feminine of master, and, like, master of the household or whatever. So I don't know. It was, like, kind of weird title, but I'm just going to run with the fact that I think Michelle Pfeiffer was supposed to be the Mistress of Evil. And so then that came down to, well, what really made her the Mistress of Evil? And, like, what were her motivations? Did she just hate fairies? And why did she hate fairies? And what is it that she wanted? And her motives kind of seemed strange at first, and I think maybe they probably could have made them a little bit clearer, because when you do, like, work out what her motives are, it actually kind of paints, like, a really interesting picture. And that's because Michelle Pfeiffer's character, the majority of, like, her scenes are, like, with Aurora. I was gonna call her Elle Fanning, but I do know her name. It's Aurora. So you've, like, Michelle Pfeiffer and Aurora have a lot of scenes together, and they are the ones I think that are, like, most clearly contrasted. So it's not really, like, Michelle Pfeiffer and Maleficent that are contrasted, but Michelle Pfeiffer and Aurora. And that's because you see Aurora being pulled into Michelle Pfeiffer's world because she's going to marry Michelle Pfeiffer's son, Philip. And so, like, Aurora comes from, like, the Moors. She wears very, like, simple clothing. She runs around barefoot, which is, like, something that's commented on in the film. She wears flowers in her hair. So she's much more, like, plain and simple, and like, loves nature and everything, and loves the fairies. Michelle Pfeiffer's character has this sort of, like, medieval, like, Renaissance mix kind of style going on, and she lives inside this castle, and she clearly, like, enjoys the wealth. Like, girl had a different outfit for every occasion. And I love that, like, her outfit for war is just like, let's just have a lot of, like, strings of silver and, like, pearls. Actually, it was probably iron, since, like, fairies aren't supposed to, like, not like iron, so she's probably wearing iron. But she was, like, covered in pearls, you know? And so I think why there is, like, the film maybe wanted to say something about, like, the idea of being contained or being suffocated, because, like, Aurora refers to it as suffocating at one point. I think it's more strongly about, like, excessive wealth, and especially because toward the end, when Michelle Pfeiffer is talking to her son, she says, like, she's started all this, like, war and everything so that she can defeat the fairies and take over the Moors so we can finally have everything we need to survive. And it's like, you're covered in pearls, I think you're doing just fine. But she is this, like, very wealthy person who, no matter how much stuff she has, it's, like, never enough. She constantly needs more wealth and more wealth and more, and so it's this constant cycle of excessive wealth. And then you combine that excessive wealth with this concept of intolerance, and I love that they gave this, like, awful backstory for her that's, like, super vague and at no point is, like, actually, like, confirmed or cleared up at all in the film, which is kind of funny. Where she tells this story to Aurora of, like, yeah, we were, it was cold and it was the winter and we were starving, and my father just wanted peace, so my brother, like, went off into the moors to ask for the fairies for help because they were doing so well, and he never came back. And I kept, like, expecting something to be cleared up about that. Like, was he killed? You know, did Maleficent see him at some point or something? Did he, like, marry a fairy and stay there? Did he just get lost? Like, nobody confirms anything. We don't see his character at all. We don't know his name. Like, he's just dropped in here. But so it's kind of, like, not a very clear backstory, but what I do like about it is that she takes this one incident that is very, like, vague and unclear, and she uses it to, like, justify a hatred of, like, an entire people, which is, like, yeah, not surprising, actually. Like, it makes a lot of sense. Like, it does, I don't want it to make sense. It shouldn't make sense, but it does, because that's like what intolerance often comes from, is that you would take one person and you would blame an entire group of people based off of like what that one person did. And so it's not just like her intolerance, but like it's the intolerance of her entire kingdom that is at play here. And the reason that the intolerance of the entire kingdom can even be at play is because she admits to something, to Aurora toward the end of the film. And that's because at the beginning of the film, opening narration is like frustratingly vague. It's like, even though Maleficent did this great thing, everybody still hated her anyway, and we don't really know why. And I was first watching that, I was like, well, that's really like vague and convenient and feels very lazy. But it like wasn't actually that lazy, because they tell you at the end the reason why everybody hated Maleficent still is because the queen knew how to manipulate a narrative in the news. She knew how to spread false or biased information in a way that fosters intolerance and like feeds fear of the other, so that she had made sure that the story of Maleficent saving Aurora in the first film was told in a way that Maleficent was still seen as the villain because she was one that cursed Aurora in the first place. So she knew how to manipulate a narrative in order to control the populace. So if everybody believes that this one person who isn't evil, who isn't the villain of the story, if they were all afraid of that person, then it's very easy to harness that fear of that person and control a populace. So if you're, afraid of a specific group of people and you put all of your energy into being afraid of that specific group of people, then you continue to support the people in power who want you to be afraid of those people and say they're going to do something about those people. So they're going to constantly feed your fear of that other group of people so that you will constantly keep them in power so that they can continue to amass wealth. And so the queen knew how to use this system to her advantage because she wanted to continue to amass wealth, because she was doing fine. She's covered in pearls. She has an outfit for every occasion. She has a room full of mannequins wearing her dresses. The first time we saw that, I was like, wow, I don't see the need for one mannequin, let alone like 8 mannequins. And like one of the mannequins she snaps the neck of in order to open a secret passage. Everything about this character was hilariously extravagant and like over the top, and it was really funny. So essentially, like, the film actually did a pretty good job of creating this like villainous character who is defined by this desire for constant and larger and greater wealth, even though she's already quite wealthy and in power, who is intolerant of an other and knows how to foster the intolerance of a whole group of people toward that same other in order to continue to amass her own power and her own wealth. And you contrast this, with Aurora, who I already said is like very much more plain, much more simple, but also actually admits at one point in the film that the castle that her father had in the first film, and therefore was her castle, she actually like doesn't live in, and she gave to the people. And I wish we could have really seen that and seen like, what have the people done with this castle? What does that look like in their little kingdom? Because Aurora is very concerned with the Moors and not the kingdom of her birth. So what's going on there, and what does that look like? I'd be really interested in that, because I think that the film didn't really focus enough on the people, even though it wanted to make this statement about like wealth and power. But it is also really interesting to contrast Michelle Pfeiffer not only with Aurora, but with the villain of the first film, which was Stefan? He was the king. We're just going to call him the king. The king in the first film, because in that first film, he was somebody who was not royal and who committed a social transgression, essentially, within, literature and storytelling. He committed a social transgression by moving from a peasant to a king, and he did this because, of course, he like cut off Maleficent's wings and tricked everybody into thinking he was like some brave fairy killer or whatever, and managed to marry the queen and have a daughter. So he became king even though he wasn't born into royalty. He wasn't a noble. And that is like a social transgression, which was really interesting to see. And then the film, in a sort of very conservative kind of direction, ends up also like killing him, of course, and therefore, like, leaving Aurora the one that's in charge of his kingdom, which she is a royal. She was born of noble blood. So you have this sort of like, we're gonna turn the tables and have somebody who's not born of noble blood be a king, but he's gonna be the bad guy and we're gonna kill him and everything's gonna go back to normal. So the first film, while has like these really interesting things about like gender and assault and potentially environmentalism, does have a very sort of conservative structure in terms of who is allowed to be wealthy and who is allowed to be a nobleman. And so it's really fascinating that the second film decided that like Aurora actually didn't keep that castle and she didn't become queen of that kingdom, and she gave the castle to the people. And it would have been stronger if we had gotten to actually like see the outcome of that. But then you do have like the villain of this film is somebody who's born of nobility, who is incredibly wealthy, who enjoys and favors wealth above like all else. And that is the reason that she is a villain. This is a little different than the things that I've had on this channel so far, but those videos, because of the amount of research that I have to do and the writing that I have to do and the editing that goes into them, take a very long time. So I'm actually currently editing a video on the Jewish mythological figure of Lilith and her appearances in shows like Supernatural and Chilling Adventures of Sabrina. A little, shout out to Cheers. So that'll be coming out really soon, but I think it'd be really fun to do these like little takes in between, because these videos don't take, months of research.